Welcome to this week's edition of Good Books Radio. Audiobooks.com is the chief underwriter for Good Books Radio, which is produced by UTRGV Media Services for Rio Grande Valley Public Radio. And now, here's your host, Dr. John Cook.
Welcome once again to another edition of Good Books Radio. I'm your host this week, Dr. John Cook, and with me today is Dr. Darío Fernández-Morera. He is an associate professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at Northwestern University, a former member of the National Council on the Humanities, holds a BA from Stanford, an MA from Penn, and a PhD from Harvard University. He has published several books and many articles on cultural, literary, historical, and methodological issues in Spain, Latin America, and the United States. And the scholarly book that we're going to be taking a look at today is entitled The Myth of the Andalusian Paradise, Muslims, Christians, and Jews under Islamic Rule in Medieval Spain. This is so timely for me. Dr. Fernández-Morera, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I took a study abroad group to Spain last year, and we actually toured Toledo and Cordoba, and we got the story that you say an awful lot of politicians and scholars are continuing to promote about how wonderful it was to live under Islamic rule in medieval Spain and all they contributed. Right. This is a myth-busting book. It talks about medieval Spain as the argument goes that medieval Spain was this wonderful place where Muslims, Jews, and Christians coexisted amicably and the benevolent supervision of enlightened Muslim rulers, and that science and technology flourished and the cultural expression was sophisticated and even secular, and the religious pluralism was written to Islamic law, and women enjoyed a degree of freedom and social respect. But the record that you find from extant works and original sources doesn't bear that out quite, does it?
That is correct. The way I got to this research was indirect. I was researching the presence of Islamic Spain in the work of Miguel de Cervantes, the author of Don Quixote. I was writing an article on that, which was published eventually. Mm-hmm. And in the course of my investigating the topic, I realized that most of what had been written about Islamic Spain was, to put it mildly, inaccurate. Mm-hmm. So I thought that this deserved a treatment of its own.
Mm-hmm. And the terror tactics and the way they went about maintaining control, I want to delve into in some detail. Now, I had to Google an awful lot of stuff because I was unfamiliar with most Islamic terms. I suppose by now the NSA is tracking my computer, but as I understand it, the group that, as some scholars put it, migrated into Spain, actually invaded and conquered a part of Spain, were Sunnis, and they followed a strict form of Sharia law interpreted by the Maliki legal documents?
Yes, that is what the texts indicate. Initially, they would not have followed the Maliki school. Malik was born after the invasion, but the texts from the Chronicles that were written by Muslims and that tell of the nature of the conquest, and also the Christian Chronicles that were written about 2 or 3 decades after the conquest, also give us a good deal of information about the views and the practices of the invaders. Later, within a century, then the Maliki school was the predominant in Muslim Spain, and then we do have the legal texts for that school. So we can see very clearly what was the legal system under which the Muslims and the Christians and the Jews lived. And those texts present a completely different picture regarding the situation of Christians and Jews, which was one of subalternity. They were third or fourth class citizens in a commonwealth dominated by Islam and Muslims, which is the whole purpose of the conquest, is to impose Islam as the supreme religion and culture.
Mm-hmm. So let's look at some of the. You start each chapter with some quotations from some folks who have promoted this notion of pardon me, of the golden age. Right. In the opening chapter, you talk about how some scholars have argued that the Muslim takeover was accomplished largely through peaceful pacts and and some even wouldn't call it a conquest and called it a migratory wave, and others said that it was carried out by force, and actually neither side is completely accurate.
Well, true, because what happens is that the terror inspired by the effectiveness of the Muslim armies was such that many of the leaders and inhabitants, the Christian ones, found it preferable to submit without fighting, and that's what one refers to as pacts. But of course they knew very well what would happen to them if they fought, because they had seen it. If you fought and you would be defeated, then of course all the warriors could be killed, and the women and the children would become slaves. The young ones would become sexual slaves. So, and the town would be razed or burned. So the consequences of resistance were terrible. So of course, in a number of cases, the leaders, the local leaders, decided to submit and become subject to Islam as dhimis, which means, quote, protected, unquote.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, that protection entailed a number of conditions that placed the dhimis in a position of inferiority vis-a-vis Islam and Muslims. Among them, the paying of a tax for protection, which was, of course, a form of extortion. It's like a gangster offering a restaurant owner, well, we're going to protect you. It's better that you pay for this protection. And there were many other details about the religious laws regarding the condition of the dhimis that placed them in a situation of inferiority,
mm-hmm.
and which contributed to the eventual extinction of Christians from Muslim Spain.
And the extinction involved some awfully bloody things, but many fled, didn't they, to the north, where they were safer?
Well, the extinction is not they were killed. That's a misconception.
Mm-hmm.
What happens is a number of factors contribute to the gradual disappearance of the Christians from Islamic Spain. And among those conditions are the desire of the Christian to escape this condition of subalternity by converting to Islam,
mm-hmm.
Which would free them from that condition, although they would still be subordinate to those who were Muslims before converting, because the society there was very stratified, and the new converts were not at the top of the social scale. Another option would be for them to flee, which again would diminish the Christian population. And then there was also the demographic factor, and which in turn had several factors. For example, the Muslim man could marry a Christian woman and have children with her, but the children would have to be raised as Muslims. You can see how that is already impacting the demographics. Whereas the Christian man could not
mm-hmm.
marry a Muslim woman, or even approach her or talk to her
mm-hmm.
under penalty of death. So you see how all these factors affect the demographics. There were also some expulsions to Africa of Christian populations from several cities over the centuries, because the Muslims did not want these Christians to collaborate with the increasing threat of the northern Christians, the northern Christian kingdoms,
mm-hmm.
which were carrying out a reconquest of the land. So to keep their territory safe, they expelled these Christians who might collaborate, and in some cases did, with the Christian warriors from the north. So they expelled them to North Africa.
Mm-hmm.
So all this contributed to the eventual disappearance of Christians from Islamic Spain.
Mm-hmm.
By the 13th century in Valencia, there were no Christians. And in 1492, when the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella entered the last kingdom of Muslims in Spain, there were no Christians there.
Mm-hmm.
So there you have it.
So the conversion factor brings up another point, and that is that a lot of academics have downplayed religion as the motivating force, but the religious factor in Islamic conquests of this type is intense.
No, the texts indicate that the religious motivation was the central one animating these warriors. We have chronicles from the Islamic side which tell that, and we also have statements, practically contemporary statements from Christian chronicles, the Chronicle of 754. That was a few decades after the invasion, and they referred to the prophet of the invaders, Muhammad. Talk about the prophet of the invaders. You're obviously talking about the religion of the invaders, which is different. And there were other Christian sources that point to these fellows who are non-Christians, who are invading the land and terrorizing the population. So there is plenty of evidence. There is also archaeological evidence that reinforces the written texts. No question about it. Of course, there was also the motivation of getting booty and slaves. The first raid in Spain by a few hundred Muslim warriors brought back a large number of female slaves, and they were described as so beautiful as they had never seen before. And this certainly would be an additional incentive to these Muslim warriors to invade the land.
Well, let's talk about that conquest. It was about the second half of the 7th century, I think, when they started sweeping out of Arabia and the Middle East and across North Africa, and then there reached a point when they crossed the Gibraltar, what we now call Gibraltar.
No, it was not called Gibraltar at the time.
Right.
It was called the Pillars of Hercules. It had been called like that for centuries. That's a Greek name. And the Muslims, as they did with a lot of geographical names, they changed it to Gibal Tariq, the Rock of Tariq. Tariq being the Muslim warrior who first entered the land. And that was part of the colonization tactics of the Muslim invaders. They would change the names of the land.
This sweeping across North Africa and into the Balkans and other places, during that time there was a lot of beheadings and displaying of enemies' heads.
So this was part of the terror tactics of the Muslim armies, which were substantiated or supported by the religious texts that again are evident. I mean, they are available. All these religious texts that indicate the desirability in the number of situations of beheading the opponent, either the infidel fighter or in cases of blasphemy against Islam, if you're a Muslim, and so on and so forth. So beheading was part of the culture, and it was quite widespread, especially in Spain. The Umayyads were great practitioners of massive beheadings of prisoners and opponents. But not only beheadings, other terrifying forms of killing as well.
Crucifixion included.
Crucifixion was widely used, and the exposing of the crucified bodies at the entrance of the great palace of Cordoba, so the population knew what would await those who did the wrong thing. So these methods were widely spread.
There's an interesting distinction here, and I kept thinking as I looked at these practices of the Islamic State today, but the distinction is the interpretation of the word jihad, which for some means an inner effort, an individual struggle for self-improvement, and for others means, a fight with a sword.
Right. Well, the scholars who claim that it means principally self-improvement and so forth may be right. I mean, they may know better than the scholars of medieval times when they interpret the text. You know what I'm saying? The scholars today may perhaps be more learned and more intelligent than those Muslim scholars of medieval times who interpreted the religious text as saying that jihad was war against the infidel. But that doesn't matter if those early interpreters were wrong. The fact of the matter is that the result of their interpretations was the Islamic conquest and the use of the methods that we have been talking about here. So it's irrelevant what the right interpretation is. Of course, if one goes to the ahadith and so forth, you find that indeed the ahadith there talk about jihad as an armed struggle against the infidels. That's what the text of the Maliki school tell us.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not an expert in the Quran, but I believe that also in Surah 5 and Surah 9 you find jihad described principally in those terms. But that's another story. I mean, my interest is not the Quran.
Mm-hmm.
It's what actually happened in Islamic Spain.
So this interpretation of the jihad being service to God and that it was obligatory for Muslim men to participate in that was part of life in this era.
Oh yeah, it was part of the everyday life of the Muslims in Muslim Spain. And as Ibn Khaldun said, it's the obligation of the Caliph to carry out jihad at least once a year in order to make the infidels submit. Now, that doesn't mean that they have to convert in the case of Jews and Christians. That's a misunderstanding. They had to submit, and that submission entailed a number of things that some of which I have mentioned earlier, but that was the whole purpose of the conquest, to make the conquered submit to Islam. And the Christians and the Jews were given the choice of conversion or becoming dhimmis or die.
Mm-hmm.
If you were not Jewish or Christian, you were a pagan, then the choice would be different. The choice would be convert or die. There was no option of
Mm-hmm.
becoming subject to Islam and pay an extortion tax, which was called the jizya.
One of the distinctions you make between this study that you've done and what some of the early writers, Christian chronicles narrating the conquest, refer to the Saracens, or the Arabs, rather than Muslims,
Right.
and that
Right.
that has an effect on the perception of everything that takes place.
Yes, because some scholars have said, look, the Christians in Spain at the time of the conquest did not refer to them as Muslims. They referred to them as Saracens or Arabs. Therefore, they could not have had in mind that they were fighting a different religion. And that's nonsense, because indeed the Chronicle Mozarabica of 754 refers to the Prophet Muhammad as their prophet. Now, if you're talking about a prophet, you're of course talking about a religion, don't you?
Mm-hmm.
And there are other texts. There is a hymn, a Visigoth hymn from about 2 decades after the conquest, which talks about these non-Christians who have invaded the land and terrified us and burned the churches and made Christians flee. And there is also archaeological evidence of coins from North Africa preceding the conquest, in which you see the name of Allah as sponsoring the jihad against the infidels. So all sorts of evidence indicates that the religion was the motivating force behind the conquest. And besides, in the Middle East, the Greek chronicles that were written in the 7th and 8th century, polemics against Islam, they referred to the Muslims also as Saracens. But you see, what it meant then was what we call today Muslims.
Mm-hmm.
Today we don't use the word Saracen. The meaning was the same. There was these people who were animated by a different religion.
One of the other things you point out that I found interesting is that the Visigoths really got a bad rap. They were referred to as barbaric, and in fact, they had some of the Golden Age knowledge that the Arabs are given credit for in their version of medieval Spain. and they had a code of law that was like way ahead of its time in terms of limiting the power of government, long before the Magna Carta was ever created.
That is true. The level of culture of Visigoth Spain was much higher than that of the Muslim invaders. Most of the invaders were Berber warriors from North Africa, led by some Arabs, who in turn had a much lower level of culture in the 7th century than Visigoth Spain had. The level of culture of the Arabs did not begin to increase until after they got in touch, by trying to conquer them, with the Persians, the Zoroastrian Persians. That's Persia is, of course, the ancient name of today's Iran. Iran, once upon a time, was not Muslim. It was Zoroastrian. Zoroastrianism has disappeared. Islam wiped it out. And also with the conquest, the contact of the Islamic conquerors with the Christian Greek Roman Empire, the so-called Byzantine Empire, which was the empire that dominated the entire Middle East and North Africa, and of course what is today the Anatolian Peninsula and Greece. Mm-hmm. All that was Christian land for many, many centuries after the fall of the Latin Roman Empire. That's the territory that the Muslims coming out of Arabia conquered.
Mm-hmm. One of the teachings of Islam is the importance of destroying the idolaters, and of course they saw the Jews and Christians as idolaters, particularly all the Christian symbols, the crosses, the statues, and so forth, and basically they just destroyed all of that.
Yes, the part of the methods, and they were partly religiously dictated, and also practically dictated. Religiously dictated, why? Because you have to destroy idols, and statues and paintings were considered idols by the religion. But it was also a practical way of erasing memories of the past that might compete with the grandeur or supposed grandeur of the Islamic present. So that was done on a regular basis. Ibn Khaldun even counts the story that one of the Muslim caliphs, after the conquest of Egypt, tried to destroy the Pyramid of Giza. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That was, of course, beyond their power to do, but they even tried to do that, again to erase something that was associated with paganism, and B, something that showed the tremendous capacity or capabilities of a culture prior to the Islamic invasion. So there was this doubly motivated impulse to erase the traces of greatness of the pre-Islamic past.
Mm-hmm. Well, I do want to touch on how women were treated in Islamic Spain. The chapter on circumcision, stoning, veils, and sexual slavery was difficult to get through, but very thorough in its exploration of how they weren't exactly free, as some historians have described them.
No, that's nonsense. The Muslim women in Islamic Spain, you had to wear, the free Muslim woman had to wear a veil. She was circumscribed to the house, couldn't go out unless accompanied by other women or very close members of the family. Circumcision was honorable for women. That's what the religious texts tell us, that circumcision is obligatory for men and honorable for women. Now, if you are a daddy or a mommy, do you want your little girl to grow up to be an honorable woman or not? Of course you do. So circumcision would have been widely spread in Islamic Spain, and also the religious texts of the time indicate that the punishment for a free Muslim married woman, if found guilty of adultery, was stoning. And of course, slavery, especially sexual slavery, was massive in Islamic Spain. Cordoba was a hub for slaves throughout the Mediterranean, as again the Muslim sources tell us. So yes, it's nonsense, all that idea of the freedom of Muslim women in Islamic Spain.
Mm-hmm. I do want to touch on the Christians and Jews as well. The Christians submitted to Islamic hegemony, or they fled, and there were
converted.
And that conversion didn't give them full rights as citizens. I mean, they had all these disparaging names for them. And I've always thought of Christianity as a monotheistic religion, but of course to Islam, they're polytheists, barbarians, infidels, reddish ones because of their white rosy skin. They were called pigs, worshippers of the idols.
Yeah, an insulting name. If you were mad at them, you call them pigs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
For obvious reasons.
Mm-hmm. So the Christian element was also isolated from the Muslim one, wasn't it?
Yes, the Christians and the Jews and the Muslims lived in their own neighborhoods. They interacted, of course, as necessary for commercial reasons, and more often the interaction would occur at the upper levels, and leaders of the two communities would interact with the leaders of the Muslim communities. And in a number of cases, leaders of the Jewish community became servants and bureaucrats under the orders of the Islamic rulers. Why? Because the Islamic rulers found it advantageous to use the Jewish population as a counterbalance to the Christian population, and B, because they could use very capable Jewish functionaries as bureaucrats and servants who would be loyal to the ruler, mm-hmm. and who would be in that regard more trustworthy than other Muslims who might try to conspire against the ruler to achieve power themselves. The Jewish functionaries would not try to do that, and of course they depended on the ruler himself for their well-being and the well-being of their community. So they would be much more loyal than other Muslim servants. So the Muslim rulers did use many Jewish leaders as functionaries, and they also used Christians as mercenaries in a number of cases.
The rules around these so-called protected groups, the Jews and the Christians, mm-hmm. Allowed them certain things, but it's almost like they were unclean. There were so many Muslim regulations regarding they couldn't touch things that had been used by the Christians. Jews weren't allowed to ride on horses. They couldn't carry weapons.
The documents indicate that the Christians, for example, would present a danger of contamination. I mean, Christians ate pig and garlic and a number of other things, which we learned from the religious laws of the time were forbidden to Muslims. So one had to be careful in one's contact with Christians, so one would not be polluted. So that was religiously inspired. In fact, Christians were forbidden to walk through Muslim cemeteries because they would pollute the tombs of the Muslims. So all that would present, as you may realize, a few obstacles to this loving interaction.
Yes, indeed.
That we have been told existed.
Absolutely. This is an enlightening book, and unfortunately we're out of time. We've been talking with Dr. Darío Fernández-Morera. The book is The Myth of the Andalusian Paradise. It is a scholarly work that is a fine myth buster and worth the read. I'm your host, Dr. John Cook. I remind you, if you don't catch our show at its regular airing times on KMBH 88 FM for the Rio Grande Valley, you can also find us on YouTube at Good Books Radio, Strong and Cook, and we have a Facebook page as well. Hope you'll like us there. Thanks for listening.